name is Robert Ganzamore, and I'm going to be your host for today's presentation. And this morning we have a very fascinating presentation from a very fascinating speaker called Dr. Ekta Patel. Today's presentation is going to be the first of many that are going to constitute a series titled Can Wildlife and Agriculture Coexist? In East African perspective. Today's topic of discussion is disease risks associated with bushmeat in rural settlements at the Kenya-Tanzania border. Our speaker today, Dr. Ekta Patel, is a scientist and the One Health Communications Coordinator at the International Livestock Research Institute based in Nairobi, Kenya. Her research focuses on the wildlife-livestock ecosystem, particularly in relation to zoonotic diseases and antimicrobial resistance. With a PhD in molecular and cellular biology and a background in microbiology, Ekta has substantial experience in drug resistance and livestock disease research. Her work includes understanding drivers of the wild meat value chain and conducting environmental surveillance to manage health risks and promote sustainable ecosystem use. Ekta's role at the ILRI involves integrating scientific research with effective communication strategies to influence policy and practices using the One Health approach for global health challenges. All right, the presentation is going to last for 1 hour. For anyone that will have a question or a suggestion or an opinion, please type it in the chat section or wait for the question and answer section that will come at the end of Ekta's presentation. We are excited to learn from Ekta's insights and look forward to a stimulating discussion. Now, please join me in welcoming her to the screen.
Hey, Robert, thank you. Thank you very much for that. And I'm just going to try and get my screen shared here. Thank you so much. And I think this is a good way to get started and start by first thanking the organizers from Screenshare Africa, as well as Africa Wildlife Economic Institute, for giving me the opportunity to present what is our case study on disease risks associated with bushmeat at the rural settlements of Kenya and Tanzania. And this is a presentation which is part of the East African Perspective Seminar series on coexistence of wildlife and livestock. I didn't realize that I was the first presenter. That's always great. So thank you very much. So today what I'm going to do is start by giving you a broad perspective on sort of challenges we foresee with the wild meat value chains and the need for a One Health approach. But then I'm going to dive into our study that we carried out at the Kenya-Tanzania border, get into some of the findings, and then close out with what's next for us. Some of the images might be sensitive to viewers, so I just want to sort of put that out there as well. So this is what I say is a bird's eye view of what our lives might look like in sub-Saharan Africa. You can see that the animals are doing their thing. People are going about their day. You've got some people, you know, planting crops, going shopping, going to the hospitals. The industrialists are going about their business and doing their thing. But all the while, it is the environment that is getting impacted. So the approach, the One Health approach is called for, which recognizes that within this bird's eye view of all of us doing our own thing, animals, people, and the environment are closely linked and interconnected. And the approach encourages collaboration across various different sectors, communities at all different levels, to address sort of the health and ecosystem threats that we may be seeing. There's also a big need for healthy food, water, energy, and it emphasizes supporting sustainable development. So a lot of what we do is sort of using aspects of a One Health approach. However, for today's seminar, I'm going to focus on the wildlife-livestock interface, which is where the International Livestock Research Institute comes in from. And while I am going to focus on the wildlife-livestock interface, I want to take the opportunity to share that ILRI itself does a lot on sort of the wildlife-human conflicts, a lot of aspects on climate change and land use changes, including working with many pastoralist communities. But allow me to share at this point that ILRI is strategically positioned across several low and middle income countries where livestock and wildlife coexist. We are across 14 different countries in East Africa as well as Asia. And then because we operate in these critical zones where we have a lot of transboundary diseases, we leverage our One Health strategy as well as our lab facilities to drive sustainable changes to address global health challenges. And as Robert mentioned, we work on sort of zoonotic diseases, food safety, as well as antimicrobial resistance. The approach we have is that sort of integrating sustainable livestock management practices with wildlife conservations, we may be able to aim to enhance and improve biodiversity, improve environmental resilience, and build resilient food production systems as the global population keeps increasing. So many of you may not be strangers to this, but I'm just going to go ahead and say some of the global challenges of the wild meat value chain, and especially enhanced by sort of the COVID-19 pandemic, was disease risks. And we have seen that there are risks along the value chain in terms of sort of hunting, processing, as well as consumption. There are significant conservation concerns in terms of overhunting. What do the threats of the threat to the population look like in terms of loss of biodiversity species, and then decline of wildlife populations. Several economic factors. It is a critical source of protein and income. And, we need to look at the balance between sort of sustainable practices and what is being done in certain countries. There's also sort of a challenge with cultural practices and behavior change. And a lot of the conversations we're having now is in East Africa specifically are we able to look at reducing risks, but also maintaining and being mindful that many cultural and communities are using it for medicinal value, for example. Another challenge that we have is that there's this need for a continuous education and awareness with communities on that changing landscape on risks. And finally, we've got regulatory changes. When you look at something, and just yesterday, I was having a conversation with Wiseman from your organization, and it's interesting. South Africa is so well established, and there's a lot to learn. There are lessons to learn. Tanzania, for example, have licenses for special harvesting of wild meat, but in Kenya and Uganda, it's completely illegal. So there is a changing narrative, and we'll come to that in a minute as well. So diving specifically into East Africa and not looking at sort of the West Africa, which is very well studied. There's known risks that are there. There's so many scientists that are in that space as well. We haven't touched with South Africa as well, and I think maybe that's a good starting point to see what's going on. But in East Africa, we consider it sort of like a black hole. There's not much being done. Not many people know on sort of like what is being harvested, what is the offtakes, what are the risks. So our primary objective was to focus on East Africa and look at sort of what is going on, especially as the demand continues to increase for animal-sourced foods. The other thing we found is that there's a lack of alternative protein sources, and our studies will come into some of that. But this idea that livestock seem to be more expensive than wildlife continues to emerge. There's also been sort of an emergence and improved in hunting techniques that's happening. It's a very good source of income for the rural communities. Some of the communities we spoke with said that they make $300 a month. And so that's a substantial amount. And then, of course, as I touched on earlier, that there's difference in regulations. When Tanzania said that they're going to open butcheries with special licenses, there was this discussion that was taking place that, well, what is Kenya doing, and should Kenya also adapt to that? Another thing that is interesting is that in East Africa, the wild meat activities are widespread, and the drivers of what is going on in sort of rural and urban consumption may be very different, and a lot is not known. And so if you look at maybe, you know, South Africa, for example, how much is supplied outside, we don't have any of that going on. We don't know what is happening sort of in the back end. And so the system is complex, the value chain is complex, and it feels like we need to be tapping into a lot of the value chain to understand what is happening, where there's a demand, and if there is potential for any sort of commercialization or sustainable use of wildlife. I'm going to sort of dive into our focus area, which was on disease risk perceptions, and also very strategic was the study was funded through the COVID-19 hub. So we know that there are known zoonotic disease outbreaks associated with wild meat activities, and these are, you know, everybody here probably knows the Ebola outbreak in Congo. We've got anthrax outbreaks, and anthrax continues to be a problem for us in East Africa, as does brucellosis outbreak that does take place in Kenya. Monkeypox was also linked with wild meat. And so a lot of the zoonotic diseases are linked to sort of the human activities, frequent and close contact, and this idea of, you know, is there pathogen spillover between wildlife and humans, or is the pathogen spillover taking place between the wildlife and the livestock, which is being amplified and then passed on to the humans. So our study was undertaken with Traffic, Nature Heritage, C4, which is also CGIAR, the Wildlife Research Training Institute, and funded by the BMZ One Health Center in Africa. And our objectives of the study were sort of first time to understand evidence that contributes towards understanding the drivers of emergence, potential spillovers, and what can we do once we know what's going on? Like, are there any interventions for prevention, as well as reduction of risky behavior, if that's the right word? So we selected sort of the Kenya-Tanzania border. Specifically, we looked at, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but sort of we are localized in this region here. We're at the Taita Taveta County on the Kenya side, which is a gateway into Tanzania. On the Tanzanian side, we selected sort of the Rombo district, which is located in sort of like northern Tanzania and the slopes of the Kilimanjaro. And most of our hotspots, so if you look at this diagram here, these little stars are pretty much where we had gone to get our surveys carried out. Much of our hotspots have been identified by the national authorities, so the Kenya Wildlife Services, as well as your Tanzanian wildlife management authorities. And once sort of our sites were selected, we used a survey-based approach. So we were there in December 2021, carried out interviews of 299 people. The idea here was to get a feel for looking at sort of males, females. We also wanted to speak with some of the children with supervision, because we want to understand the role that everyone's playing to better understand the dynamics within a family. Interviews were carried out in pairs to keep the conversations going. And we used a free, prior, and informed consent approach in the villages that we've visited. Most of our survey-based questions are very simple, sort of like your Likert scale, strongly agree, agree, disagree, and then the binary responses of your yes and no. So I'm going to go through the next couple of slides to share some of the results. And let me just share very sort of off the top of the head, was when I went in, I was looking at this as a single system along the border. We were not expecting variations in responses from the Kenyan side and the Tanzanian side, which was really awesome because it shows you how maybe the difference in regulations may be affecting community perception. So I'm really excited to share that with you. So first off, the wild meat, 79% of all of our respondents believe that it's risky to eat some animals, which was really interesting. This infographic here shows sort of the most of the time it was the ungulates that were consumed, and then we had the rodents and birds and shrews that were being consumed. But majority of the communities believe that hyenas were very risky to consume, followed by primates and snakes. There was significant awareness of zoonotic diseases spread from wildlife to the communities. And, it was really refreshing to see that Ebola, anthrax, and brucellosis, they would be able to name the diseases themselves. So that was really fantastic. 20% believed that 20%, because we were looking at the COVID-19 component, 20% of the people did think that wild meat can be transmitted, can transmit COVID-19, which is also very interesting. 70% say that the pandemic did not affect consumption. If anything, maybe it might have increased. 50% of our respondents believe that eating wild meat leads to sort of foodborne diseases. And in the survey-based questions, when we sort of digressed into our conversations, it was interesting. A lot of people did complain of sort of diarrheal diseases associated with the wild meat consumption. At the bottom here is a study that had been carried out with Traffic USAID in Tanzania. And it was great to see, because they were part of this study as well, that the categories of species on demand were similar to what we were seeing in our study also. A big one for us, and continues to remain, is looking at the gender roles. What are the gender roles in the wild meat value chain is important if we are going to have any sort of interventions. And when I say interventions, not only sort of reduction in disease risks, but if there is potential for scale out or sustainable use. One of the things we found is that women are generally found to be selling the meat, which affects households, especially when penalties are enforced. So if, for example, you're in Uganda, the prison sentence is harsh and it affects the entire household when the mother has been taken out, as opposed to some other countries which may have shorter sentences. On the topic of COVID-19 concerns, men were found to be more concerned than women. And on the topic of animal conservation and disease transmission, men thought it not to be sold for those reasons. Mass media contribution played a key role in sort of knowledge awareness and dissemination across the two countries. Education contributed to the understanding that if you wash your hands every time you handle wild meat, it reduces the risks of diseases. In Kenya, 80% of the respondents thought that the wild meat was more riskier to eat than other meats. And on the Tanzanian side, 50% thought that it was to think that wild meat is riskier than other meats. One of the things that we were addressing is that, do the different regulatory measures impact community perceptions and behaviors? Because one of the things that we did find is that more of the Kenyan responders felt that for conservation purposes, we should not be consuming wild meat. So I just want to sort of share some concluding remarks, which are that rural communities, and that was really great to see that rural communities are aware of zoonotic disease risks, but they continue to practice these risky behaviors because there's no alternative source of proteins. Their claims were that livestock is more expensive, whereas the wildlife do not have a value. It's a very economical, viable business. If you're not able to send your children to school, but you're able to move bushmeat, wild meat, across the value chain and make $300, it seems like a good business. And there are no different, government incentives on doing something else. And I think understanding drivers can inform sort of these social and behavioral change interventions to reduce the risky behaviors through community engagement, educational and outreach tools, which is sort of a good segue into what some of our next steps look like. At the moment, we are undertaking a study to look at the urban demand drivers and disease risks in wild meat value chains across a very busy area in Kenya, along a highway which is known to be selling some of the meat. So we're going to start that. We're also very keen to get into community engagement discussions at the Kenya-Tanzania border in terms of raising awareness on disease risks. And we will be in Cape Town at the World One Health Congress, where on the 20th of September, we're going to be launching systematic literature review on eating wild animals, risks, rewards, and recommendations. So if any of you are in Cape Town at the conference, please do come and visit us. We will have a big ILRI booth. And yes, put my contact information out there so that if there is this potential for knowledge sharing and learning across the different continents, I know South Africa has been doing really well. And if there is a way for us to sort of like share lessons learned, I think that would be fantastic. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ekta. I think this was an enlightening presentation, and most of us, considering myself, we didn't know much of what the risks of consuming wild meat presents. And I think this is now for the questions and answer section, but I will use the opportunity and ask a question. I think in the audience, you can consider asking your question, either putting the question in the chat section or raising your hand, and we'll get to hear from you. So my question is, considering the fact that in the research, 79% said that it's risky. They know that it's risky to consume wild meat, and considering the fact that in the value chain, you say that the demand continues to increase. So considering the fact that they know it's of risk to consume the meat while they keep demand for this meat, why do you think the demand keeps increasing, and what should the communities do to prevent that?
Yeah, Robert, great. And that was one of the questions that we had was, the risks are there and they continue to practice what we are calling the risky behavior. But I think there's no other alternatives. And I think we're very keen to work with sort of our local, the national organizations and governments to identify how we could sort of have either a sustainable use system implemented or provide alternative uses. But like I said, our study was done in very sort of rural and remote areas. I think it would be very interesting, this upcoming study, to look at what is going on in the urban demand. For example, we've carried out some molecular analysis by randomly sampling the meat, and it is a published study as well, so I can sort of share this with you. And we found sort of like in your samosas, you've got wild meat in there, and it's not just beef or mutton, for example. So the idea is, are people going in these joints and knowing that they're eating wild meat, or is it just being substituted because it's cheaper to do so? So that's something that we're going to start looking into and uncovering.
From the audience, if anyone has a question, this is the time. Yes, Sia.
Hi, Ekta. Thank you so much for that presentation. First of all, it was really fascinating. I'm just wondering if you would have any kind of programs in place to sort of maybe subsidize livestock meat instead, to make that the cheaper option, and in that way reduce the bushmeat trade and therefore the risks associated. Is there anything like that going on?
So not at the moment, CL. We're trying to establish these mechanisms, and that's why I was really excited about this presentation, because I figured that there's people in this space, and are we able to move that narrative? I mean, should livestock be the alternative? Should it be aquaculture? Should it be something else? So no, the question is, again, in East Africa, it is a little bit of a black box, and we are trying to identify what that looks like. So I'm more than happy for anyone who's interested in the space to sort of share thoughts.
Great, thank you.
So Francis from the chat section asked the question, and he was like, will a more transparent and formal trade in wild meat make it easier to manage and mitigate risk? Are there measures used in the livestock meat trade which could also be used for the wild meat trade?
Yeah, Francis, I think that's a great question. I think that one of the things that we believe that by making it more transparent and formal, I think there is going to be a demand. And I'm not sure how many of you know, but I think in the early 2000s, there was a big, we've had conservancies that have been farming wildlife. But since then, when the government came in and cracked down, I think they put a strong ban on this. So I think there is an underlying demand that is there. Understanding that demand, whether it is for trade or is it for consumption, we need to figure that out. We just don't know. And yeah, there are measures in sort of livestock meat trade that could be sort of just a copy and paste for what's going on in wildlife.
So Francis, also James Rubina, will get to you back, but Francis went ahead and asked also, what is the nexus, if any, between wild and domesticated animals disease?
Francis, that's a great question. And, what is interesting is one of the things that we are seeing is, who's the reservoir of the pathogen? If we are saying that the wildlife are the reservoirs of certain viruses, is that spillover taking place in sort of your domestic animals? And is there an amplification as well? So for example, with the anthrax, we see that, is it being amplified within the livestock systems and then getting spilt over into the human population?
All right, so Rubina James asked, how are livestock meats like ostrich, which is available on the market in Kenya, being regulated, and how can we emulate best practices?
Rubina, great to have you here, and thank you for being here. So absolutely, I am actually not sure about how ostrich meat is being regulated, but we did speak with our national partners, and it's not only just ostrich meat, which I learned, but there's also sort of crocodile meat, which is being farmed. And we may be able to look at that and copy and paste best practices once we understand the demand within the country.
In the chat section, there are no more other questions, but I have a funny question, Dr. Ekta, if you don't mind.
No, absolutely. I'm happy to have a conversation on this.
All right. Have you ever consumed the wild meat?
I think as a child I did. We've got the, I don't know if you've been here to Kenya, but we've got the carnivore restaurant. And at the carnivore restaurant, they used to sell all sorts of things from crocodile meat, which I believe I've tried deer. I was in Cape Town myself for at UCT studying there for my doctoral degree. So I've had some interesting meat in Cape Town as well. But I'm not sure if I'm brave enough to venture into any more of that now.
All right. So if you were to advise someone on consuming a certain wild meat, would you consider that, or it's just prohibited?
No, I would leave that to the individual's discretion. I mean, how much do they need the nutrition? I would leave it up to them. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ekta. You just brought back the memories of carnivore to me as well, because I live here in Naivasha and I've grown up in Kenya as well, so I've also been there. But that just got me thinking about how the legislation is so different in countries all across Africa, and also in Kenya, how it's sort of changed as well. I mean, what would be the kind of reasoning behind whether the wild bushmeat consumption is allowed or not allowed? Have you found anything to compare sort of between Tanzania and Kenya, or is it just some kind of a preference or conservation related? Or
so one of the things that we did have, we had a really good discussion with the Ministry of Wildlife and Tourism, and this was just before COVID hit, and they did say to us that tourism wasn't attracting enough income into the country. And there was this thinking that, can we start looking and exploring sort of sustainable use of wildlife? what does that look like across everything, whether it's handbags that you're making or food that you're consuming. So that conversation had started, and it was just very ironic at the time when Tanzanian had put these regulations in place. One of the things that I would share is that I think there is an underlying demand that is there, which is not very well understood. When I speak of demand, I'm speaking specifically at the Kenya section. We don't know what's going on in Uganda, but everybody is sort of got eyes on South Africa, and that's the way it looks like. Well, look how well South Africa is doing. And then you say, well, look what's going on in Tanzania. And two things I will share with you. One that came out from our study was that the respondents from the Kenyan side said that the wild meat was being hunted in the Kenyan borders, and through the porous borders, they're moving into Tanzania. So you're not able to track where that animal has come from. And so then do you get a depletion effect of tourism and animals, even when you're in Kenya, for example? What happens to all the giraffes, for example, if they're all going to be hunted and then legally taken into some sort of a legal system in Tanzania? And then the other thinking was that, what are we able to do in terms of expansion and creating good regulatory systems across those borders? Conservation practices are playing a role in terms of less consumption and risks. But if the governments are able to provide some sort of incentives, that may change the narrative there.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess it's so hard to control because the borders are not, it's not a physical border. So any giraffe from Kenya could wander over in Tanzania, and then it's, fair game for them because of the difference in legislation. So you need that kind of working together of the two governments, don't you, and the countries that border each other.
And furthermore, rather than just only looking at this idea, I mean, it's similar to sort of transboundary diseases, is the same approach that we took. And I think Francis mentioned this, like, what can you mimic? And we were saying the same thing. If you're going to accuse an animal that has come from the Kenyan side to spread potentially zoonotic disease, you want to have your legislation and your regulations really tightened so that we're able to say, okay, these are the rules in place. And there's no sort of finger pointing on where did the disease come from, especially when you're looking at transboundary components.
Yeah, exactly. Great, thank you.
Thank you, Sia. And from James Maratza, he asked, what are the main challenges of regulating wild meat?
James, I actually don't know what the main challenges are of regulating wild meat. I mean, like in Kenya at the moment, it's just flat illegal. And until the government doesn't sort of share sort of policies or recommendations to try and get this sort of this narrative moved to say that we're going to start legalizing it in some component, I'm not able to speak to that in terms of regulation. I am aware that there are conversations going on at the government levels to explore some of this, but I'm not sure where they are with any of this.
All right, Francis, I would ask you to unmute yourself and ask the question if you don't mind.
Sure, I can do it. This is such a fascinating topic and one that I know absolutely nothing about professionally. So that's why I'm asking all these questions in the chat, because it's so interesting and it's so important. Just in the South Africa one, for example, is people in East Africa may not know, and some may know, there's a large dried meat industry, biltong they call it. And you can get kudu biltong, wildebeest biltong, springbok, ostrich. You can even get vegan biltong in Cape Town now, but that doesn't count. But the whole management of that industry is very informal. So you don't even know if the kudu biltong is donkey. You don't even know the quality of the meat, let alone any disease factors. But there is a lot of regulation, especially of buffalo, moving buffalo around because of the disease risk and disease concerns. So there's lots of places buffalo can't even move to, or they have to be disease-free and checked and all that. So there are regulations that can be put in place. But the question I have is about, what about the potential to actually go from a harvested animal to a meat product in the bush butchers, if you will, bush abattoirs to bush butchers. And if you were to prepare the product in the bush and it checked, and so on, that would create rural employment. But I think, now me being ignorant, would preparing harvested meat in the bush under, proper safety conditions also help to mitigate disease risk. So the meat coming to the carnivore could actually be prepared, say, out in the Rift Valley and then shipped in cold truck, as opposed to the carcass being moved or even the live animal being moved.
Yeah, Francis, and I think that's absolutely right, and I think that's what's been happening. I mean, right now it does seem like that's the practice that is happening in Kenya, though happening very illegally. Interesting. In Tanzania, it sounds like that's what the rollout mechanism was, that you need to have a special license. And I don't know if anyone's seen this. Unfortunately, I don't have a photo of it, but it was in Dodoma County where they opened up the first butchery. And instead of having sort of a cow and a sheep on it, they've got a zebra and what have you. So you know that you can go into that butchery and you're going to find the wildlife meat bush butchery, as you called it, is what's going to happen. The other thing is, I don't know if we've got any of our Tanzanian counterparts online and if they're there, but the idea that one of the things that happened is that they went from having just a few butcheries to, I want to say, hundreds. And so that regulation of making sure that you're sustaining the numbers seems to be a little bit of a question in the Tanzania side.
Okay. Can I just say one more quick thing on Kenya? Kenya's Wildlife Service now has a strategy, GraphSed strategy, they call it KWS 3.0, that actually has wildlife economy as a key result area, which is going to be a focus on meat. I mean, they're not reintroducing trophy hunting in the country, but they might move into the direction we're talking about here. So it's certainly something to look out for, and in response to the next questions you have to deal with. Thanks.
Thank you, Francis. And Zig, if you don't mind, also you can unmute yourself and ask the question. He asked, would you not say that the Kenyan government wildlife policies have been captured by the animal rights groups?
Yeah, Zeke, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. I haven't looked at sort of what the animal rights group are saying. And I think, yeah, anything to do sort of with the animal right movement in terms of wildlife harvesting, wildlife use, or even the economy, those are things I've not tapped into. And I think, like I said, it's also very sort of a controversial space right now. Because the governments are trying to do something, the governments are trying to expand and improve the economy, but it's finding that balance as well.
So Eddington asked, I'm just wondering, what is the voice of the animal rights? I'm just wondering, what is the voice of the animal rights movement saying about the wildlife harvesting economy?
Yeah, Robert, I think that's similar to sort of like what Zeke's mentioned, right? I mean, I have absolutely no idea what's going on in terms of where the animal rights movement is on this and what they're saying. But no, I mean, I think it's a good segue and it's something for me to look into as well to try and see if there is any sort of correlation there.
Okay, we can hear from Johan. I think he has something to say as well.
Thanks, Robert. Ekta, thank you very much. I attended a conference last year in October in the Garden Route, South Africa, where a similar topic was discussed. And there was a survey done among rural hunters in the Eastern Cape of South Africa, where the assumption was generally that they are hunting because of economic circumstances and they had to substitute their diet with illegal meat. But the result of the survey showed that they actually hunted because it was a cultural activity and that they would hunt regardless whether they had the money to buy from a supermarket or not. So I was just wondering, any insights in the Eastern African side?
Yeah, so our surveys did ask the respondents for any sort of like cultural practices. Interestingly, it was not done for cultural practices, which we found really interesting. And mainly it was for pure consumption and the economic value. But I am aware, especially as you move further west, that there is a lot of cultural medicine use that is being practiced, but we haven't yet encountered that. But a really interesting space to like look at.
Rubina, if you can unmute yourself.
So much. First of all, thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure to talk to you. What I'm curious about is, I mean, we've been sort of focusing on sort of like the traditional herbivores, et cetera, which seem to be palatable to people, irregardless of the fact that they might be like. My concern is what starts to happen when we go to bats, for example, or insects. Because the concern is, if there is a potential for disease, obviously you want to, and I realize this is a huge ask, but at the same time, you want to be giving the population what those diseases are, so that folks are more aware that, okay, eating this may give you that. But then when we're talking about sort of the non-traditional, and we know, and the previous speaker made a really good point, that some folks are actually resorting to wild meat for economic purposes, irregardless of the culture. But, how aware are these populations of the diseases that they're putting themselves or exposing themselves to, and what they are? And, should the ministries of health, for example, so we're looking at sort of the interministerial, where you're talking to ministries that are not just focused on lifestyle, but Ministry of Health, for example, saying this is an issue that is going to raise its ugly head, in some cases has already done that, because folks are eating these things, and we can't just confine it to researchers, scientists, and conservationists, but this is an issue that could have far greater reach than just, animal rights, et cetera, et cetera. So, my curiosity is, where would you see, for example, Ministry of Health, if you were not already doing it, being involved in this really critical issue of disease from eating wild meat of all sorts? Thank you.
Yeah, Rubina, thanks so much. So I'm gonna take all of you through like a little bit of a molecular journey. I'm gonna share something with you. There is a theory that communities are consuming rodents. And scientifically, we know that rodents are reservoirs for some of the most dangerous zoonotic pathogens. However, the thinking is that when these community members are going and catching and trapping some of the rodents, they may be getting scratched in the process. And when I mean scratched is maybe during the handling process, or, try to capture one and escaped. And so you're getting a micro dose of the virus. And these micro doses of viruses means that you're not fully sick. You're just getting a micro dose, your immune system's responding to it. And before you knew it, it's sort of like, I'm a little sick. I feel better after 3-4 days. I've had a fever. I'm better. So does it mean that these communities are building some sort of immunity towards some of these pathogens? We just don't know. And the proposal here is that, for example, we've seen that there is a community in coastal aspect of Kenya that is consuming rodents. And we are trying to see if we can get the ministry to come in, because remember, as a livestock research institute, and working at the wildlife-livestock interface, we aren't that public health facing, but can the public health teams come in here so that we are able to sample the population of people and look at what's going on as far as that immunology and the molecular work's going on? Do we test positive for the rodents? Yes. Are the humans also surviving and doing well, but also testing positive? We just don't know. So it's really interesting to try and peel off those layers to see what's going on in these communities who have been practicing this, what we're calling risky behavior for centuries. The other question is like, what is it going to take? Is it just going to take a single virus, or do you need to be in, does it need to be a heavy load of virus or constant exposure? So there's so many different variables, but I think the Ministry of Health has a role to play, a critical one, especially if you're going to start looking at pandemic preparedness within countries, to say, let's get under this and let's address what's going on within communities and try and understand spillover.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ekta. I think this now draws us closer to the end of the presentation. It was a great presentation, and I think everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. Everyone in the room, we have another presentation on the 15th of August. So if you can join us in that presentation as well, we'll appreciate that. If nothing else, Ekta, you can say the closing remarks, and then that's it for today. Thank you.
Yeah, no, Robert, again, to you, your teams, Screen Share Africa, Francis, all of you guys, thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to speak and share some of the findings. And really more than happy to sort of continue this collaborative work. I'm not sure where everybody comes from, but, you know, reach out on email if you find something interesting. We'd be more than happy to collaborate and expand and understand more of what's going on and how we can move the needle to improve our understanding. So thank you once again, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ekta. And I think I am from Rwanda, and many of us are from African countries. Sia is from Kenya, and she has something to say as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much for reaching out to us. That was a really fascinating presentation. And yeah, we've just all really enjoyed it. And just, yeah, once again from Share Screen anyway, a big thank you, Ekta.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.